Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Be sure to follow us, by the way, on Twitter at twitter.com/UNCknowledge. Twitter.com/UNCknowledge. Send comments, suggestions. Let us know the guests you'd like to see. A classicist and military historian, Victor Davis Hanson, is a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He's the author of countless, and they are countless, I tried to do a count, Victor, countless essays and columns, and of books that include Warfare and Agriculture in Classical Greece, The Western Way of War, Infantry Battle in Classical Greece, A War Like No Other, How the Athenians and Spartans Fought the Peloponnesian War, Carnage and Culture, Landmark Battles in the Rise to Western Power. And that names about a third of your opus, I think. Our topic today, an essay that Dr. Hanson published on National Review Online this autumn, entitled The New Old World Order. Quote, I'm quoting you, Victor, "The post-Cold War New World Order is rapidly breaking apart. Nations are returning to the ancient passions, rivalries, and differences of past centuries." Close quote. Very briefly, why is this happening?
Well, it's happening because all of these artificial constructs like the European Union or the United Nations or even things like NATO, they have a small shelf life and they're not as strong emotions as tribal affinities, ethnic affinities, religious affinities. And so the world is returning to the way it's always been.
All right. Segment one, Take Europe. Victor Davis Hanson, quote, "Take Europe. The decades-old vision of a united Europe is dissolving. Divides between Germany and Greece, for example, remain too wide to be bridged by fumbling bureaucrats in Brussels." Close quote. The European Union, they just celebrated their 50th anniversary a couple of years ago to enormous self-acclaim, at least. So what's going on?
Well, there'll always be a European Union. It just won't do anything. It'll be sort of like the Masonic Lodge today in small-town America. It's going to be there, but nobody's going to really belong or do much to it. So when I read the Greek newspapers today, or I read the German newspapers, it reminds me of 1939. You got all the stereotypes that you've always had. There's sunny people down south in places like Italy and Spain and Greece, and they're lazy.
But unserious.
Yes, they're yelling, they wave their hands, they don't know how to do accounting. They take siestas, and then there's all these rigid Nordic and Germanic peoples that are working from 6 to 6 to pay for them. That hasn't changed. It goes back to antiquity. So the European Union tried to, by fiat or convention, say that they wouldn't exist anymore, those differences. But the difference between Greece and Germany is much more than Mississippi and Minnesota.
Well, so you just said that the European Union will just sort of continue to exist. All those bureaucrats in Strasbourg and Brussels will remain in place but become irrelevant.
Yes, I think so.
It'll be just kind of a dead weight on European society. Will the euro, the currency, endure?
I think there'll be, at some point, the Germans will not want to subsidize everybody, and they'll go back to their mark, and then they'll go back to the drachma and devalue it. When I lived in Greece, what Greece is doing now happened all the time, and all they would do is devalue the currency, inflate the economy, and then sort of laugh and sleep their way back to prosperity. And they can't do that now with the euro, but they will be able to when it breaks apart. I think it will gradually. It'll be an insidious process. It'll be with a whimper rather than a bang.
You're familiar with Mark Stein's argument in America Alone that Muslim immigration and high Muslim birth rates are transforming Europe into Eurabia. Recent events in Europe, June 9th, Dutch elections. Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom wins 24 seats, becoming the third biggest party in Parliament. September 14th, the French Senate approves a ban on wearing the burqa, a ban that had already passed the French Assembly by 335 to 1. September 19th, the Swedes hold elections, and a party called Sweden Democrats wins 20 seats in the 349-member parliament. I'll quote the AP. Quote, "The far-right party," we're talking about Sweden Democrats, "demands sharp cuts in immigration and has called Islam the greatest foreign threat since World War II." Close quote. So, the drift to Eurabia is being arrested? Europe, there's a reassertion of Europe proper?
They have two problems, and it transcends demography, because in theory, it wouldn't matter how many Muslims came if they became good Europeans. That's not happening for two reasons. The European left is multicultural, and that is they don't believe in themselves. They can't argue that Europe is better than the alternative. They have no concept of the history or appreciation of the Renaissance, Enlightenment. They don't see themselves as exceptional. So then why should people who come see them as exceptional? So they're not integrating people in the way the United States is doing a much better job, at least until recently. And then the other problem is Europe's always been, for all of its socialism, a class-bound society. It doesn't intermarry, it doesn't integrate as well as the United States. We're a plutocratic society. You can get status by making money, no matter what you look like, where your parents were born, or where you go to school. In Europe, you're always located in time and space by where you were born, the sound of your voice, who your parents were, and that makes it very hard for immigrants to get social, economic, cultural acceptance. And you put that left and right-wing impediment, and then you end up with something like Rotterdam or the suburbs around Paris. So I'm very pessimistic about that.
In Rotterdam or suburbs around Paris, you have an extremely dense Muslim-only population where there's at least a tendency towards Sharia. It's simply a kind of Muslim world implanted in Europe.
And it's full of self-contradictions where they want to escape the autocracy of the Middle East and the poverty. They come to the West and they are given freedom, but then they resent the fact that they're unequal. They want instant parity because that's what they've told the EU does. And then the EU says, well, we give them all this money, we give them all these entitlements as long as they don't come into our neighborhoods. Why are they angry? And that's
so the problem is insoluble.
It's insoluble.
All right. Europe and the United States. CNN Online on September 28th, quote, a potential plot against Europe was one factor contributing to the uptick this month in missile strikes by unmanned drones against terrorist targets in Pakistan, according to a U.S. official. The U.S. official is quoted as saying, we would be remiss not to try to take action to thwart what might be underway in Europe, close quote. It's a long time since Europe lay prostrate in the ruins of the prostrate, I'm reaching the age at which that difference matters, after the Second World War. This is now a rich society. Why isn't the defense of Europe the business of Europe?
Two reasons. One is that it's a generic truth for any society that the more affluent and leisured they become, the less they're willing to make sacrifices. And you add that to the demographic paradox where you only have one child who's a precious child. So that European parents are saying, we need more money for all these social entitlements, especially as we age. We only have one child. We don't want to lose him in some god-awful place like Afghanistan. And that creates a utopian pacifism.
But why should we Americans continue to insulate them from reality?
Well,
we've been taken nothing but the back of their hand since the war on radical Islam began.
We do, because 1917 and 1918 and the failure of the Versailles Accords, and then the disasters from when we got in 41 to 45, and we decided somewhere around 1946 that these people will kill each other and they will draw us in unless we create the United Nations or NATO, or they create the EU, and that was the premise. But what we never, in our wildest imaginations, thought is that the more that we would subsidize their defense, the more like angry, petulant teenagers, they would resent their parents for that subsidy, and that's what's happened.
Segment 2, Asia. Victor Davis Hanson, quote, one of two rather bleak Asian futures seems likely. Either an ascendant China will dictate the foreign policies of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, or lots of new freelancing powers will appear to deter China since it cannot count on an insolvent U.S. for protection, close quote. So which of those two do you consider more likely?
Well, they're not antithetical, as we just saw with the problem with the Japanese and the Chinese over a fishing boat. And what we're seeing is that China wants recognition, influence, and power commensurate with its economic success. So it's basically letting it be known to places like Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, that this is our area of influence. And they're looking to us and saying, is that true or not? Because you're way over there and we have to deal with all of this Chinese money. And we're saying, we don't know. We have budget deficits. And so what's happening is, I think, that within the next 20 years, Japan will probably very seriously take a look at going nuclear. South Korea may have to go nuclear. And if they don't go nuclear, they're going to become under the influence of China's bullying. And I think that's the problem we're having right now.
Why shouldn't the future of Asia lie in Asian hands? This is a variation of the question I just asked about Europe. What is the American interest? Why shouldn't we, after getting drawn into the Second World War and having had to police all of the Pacific since the attack on Pearl Harbor, why shouldn't we say, thank goodness, Japan, you're a rich society. Taiwan, handle the problems yourselves.
Because
work it out, strike the balance.
History doesn't start at A and then end at Z. It's cyclical. So we looked at Asia before we got involved, and we saw what Japan's co-prosperity sphere was like, and then we saw again in the 50s what that Mao and Stalin had envisioned for places as diverse as Korea or Vietnam, and we said, you know what, that's not going to happen. We're going to let these countries decide their own futures, and they're going to be consensual, and they're going to be capitalist. And the result, you can't criticize the result. I mean, we created things like everything from South Korean Kias to Japanese Hondas by allowing those people in Asia to be free and have their own destiny in their own hands. And that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to interfere. We're just trying to say if countries want to be self-determining and free, the United States is going to promote that. And we're going to do that because that's our values. And every time we didn't do that, we get drawn in because we're, as our president says, we're a Pacific country.
As recently as the Clinton administration, when China engaged in military maneuvers on the Strait of Taiwan, opposite Taiwan, we sent an aircraft carrier group through this, used to be called the Strait of Formosa. The strait, it still does on my map in the kitchen. Would we do that today?
I don't think so. I think that Obama believes, or President Obama believes, that problems in the world are a result of misunderstanding, miscommunication, mixed signals, and because he's so eloquent and charismatic, non-traditional, appeals to the way most of the people in the world think and look, he thinks, at least in his own words he says that, then by his singular diplomacy he can iron out these differences. He doesn't see that most problems in Asia and in the world in general both predated and transcended George Bush. In his way of thinking, Bush did it. He was a twangy Texan Christian. He didn't have my heritage and landscape that I bring to the problem, and therefore things got worse, and now I'm here and they're going to get better. And we've seen that therapeutic approach didn't quite work.
You talked about the result of free markets in Asia. Can't argue with that, you said. New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman, this is writing in September, quote, "One-party autocracy certainly has its drawbacks, but when it is led by a reasonably enlightened group of people, as China is today, it can also have great advantages. It is not an accident that China is committed to overtaking us in electric cars, solar power, energy efficiency, batteries, nuclear power, and wind power," close quote. What do you make of this, what's called the Beijing consensus, this emerging view that maybe they actually are better suited to the future than our form of government?
If you gave me 10 minutes and the internet, I could give you, quote, almost a verbatim quote from what left-wing people said about Mussolini in the 20s and what right-wing people like Charles Lindbergh said about Germany. Same thing.
They make the trains run on time.
They make the trains and they're efficient. But China has a rendezvous with radical pollution problems, cleanup, demographic problems, its shrinking population.
Mark Stein says they'll grow old before they grow rich.
Yeah, one child with male imbalance between the sexes. Somehow their brilliant foreign policy cooked up a nuclear Pakistan, a nuclear North Korea, a nuclear Russia, soon to be a nuclear Iran, and maybe in the future a nuclear Taiwan and Japan, all on their borders. So they've got problems that they have rendezvous with, all of them. And I don't get this fascination because you fly into the Shanghai airport and everything looks great in a way that Kennedy doesn't, then suddenly they're the avatars of the future. What Thomas Friedman would need to do is get on a bicycle and go across rural China and then compare that with biking across Nebraska and see which society is more resilient and stable.
Segment 3, south of the border, Victor Davis Hanson. Quote, "Mexico devolves daily into a more corrupt and violent place than Iraq or Pakistan. The fossilized leadership in Mexico City shows no interest in reforming, counting on the more than $20 billion in remittances that return to the country each year. But Americans are tired of picking up the tab to subsidize nearly 15 million poor illegal aliens." Close quote. Mexico, bad, and getting worse. You want to stick with that assertion?
Oh, yeah, I think so.
Okay, let me give you a
Absolutely.
counter-argument about the Mexican government.
Yep.
Far from proving passive, for 4 years, the president of Mexico, Felipe Calderón, has been struggling to recapture control of the country from the drug organizations. 28,000 Mexicans killed in this, 2,000 of them state and federal police. So I put it to you, Victor, that you ought to support Calderón's effort to regain control of his country at least as stoutly as you supported George W. Bush's effort to put down the insurgency in Iraq.
That's a different question.
Okay, so draw the distinctions.
Because we're in the 11th hour in Mexico. This is a tactical decision. The Mexican government, in an existential war's existence, says at the 11th hour we've got to finally turn on these drug leaders and corruption. But what they don't make the connection is that if you didn't have drug cartels, you'd have to invent them in Mexico. Because when you have a statist economy and a non-transparent economy and a class-bound racist culture, you're going to get
racist meaning the Spanish descent,
Spanish,
lording it over the
yes,
indigenous
peoples. And when you have all of those problems that have not been addressed and papered over, then you're going to get something like the drug cartel, and you're going to have to fight it. But the real question is President Calderón, is he going to bring in transparency? Is he going to open up the society to foreign investment? Is he going to readjust the tax code? Is he going to allow people to have buy and sell land freely and have title to it?
You're being so impatient because they're along but along the Texas border they were doing pretty well, and in Monterrey, which is the second biggest city in Mexico, in the last decade, business has become more normal in Monterrey. It's a wealthy, you can do business in Monterrey almost as easily as in Miami. There are spots where they're improving in Mexico.
No, Peter.
Why are you so impatient?
There's a highway in the indigenous part of Mexico in the center, and Mexican government says, if you live in Chiapas, if you live in Oaxaca, I suggest you go north. Mm-hmm. Go north, and for the first time in your life, we will champion your civil rights when you get arrested in the Tulare County Jail. And by the way, send us $25 billion a year so that we don't have to pay for social programs for your families. But on the other side, on the western coast, suddenly we're going to discover things like property rights, investment, because we're going to build and advertise resort communities in Baja for wealthy white people to have a second and third home. So you ask yourself, if Mexico can do that in Baja, why can't they do anything in Oaxaca? And the answer is that we're getting back into a statist, state-run economy, a corrupt elite, a racist elite, and a United States that all they have to say is the Mexican War, the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, any one of those buzzwords, and people are supposed to forget all of their complaints against the Mexican government. So they march.
I just want to push you a little bit on the trajectory. You really think Calderón is worse than Lopez Portillo in the 80s?
No, I think he's better. I think that, but that's not the question. The question is he going to address the underlying problem that makes Mexico
he's
Mexico?
Struggling for his political...
No, he doesn't. He can't. He's not in a position to do that. So he's going to survive, perhaps, by taking on people who would... I mean, he has no choice. He either fights back or he doesn't exist. But the question is he going to be able to convince the elite to make the sort of changes that would turn it into a country like Chile or the United States? And the answer is no.
Counter-argument on immigration. Since 2005, the inflow of illegal aliens from Mexico has dropped by 2/3. Part of that is because we have a weaker economy up here. The magnet is less powerful, but part of it is surely increased American resources at the border, including the incomplete border fence. Incomplete, but a couple hundred miles in place. So my word to you is, Victor, relax. The worst of the immigration problem is already over. Mm-hmm. Americans will calm down as they see that we're reasserting control at the border. And then over a period of time, these X million who are here illegally can be digested, dealt with, assimilated. That's the counter-argument. What do you make of it?
Well, I wrote an article called Mexifornia, Do We Want Mexifornia in 2002? And the book came out in 2003, and that's exactly what I said. I said we have to have increased border support, scrutiny. We have to fine employers. If we have an economic downturn, it will not be so attractive. We have to push assimilation. We have to build a fence. A lot of us wrote that. And the result of all of that pressuring
it's working.
Is starting to work. But the central problem is that there's a two-pronged dilemma. The right wants to close the border and assimilate people. And that we should deport people who just got here. We should deport people who are on entitlements and not working. We should deport people who have a criminal record. But there's still going to be 7 or 8 million people here who are following the rules and working and came under the assumption it was open borders. So we're going to have to work with them, earn citizenship, make them. We have a lot of leverage. For the first time, we can say to somebody, yeah, you can listen to Spanish television, you can do all that, bilingual interpreters and all that, but you're going to have to learn English. You're going to have to take a test about American citizenship. We can do that, but we can work with them. And on the other hand, the left, we know when you're talking about things are getting better, they are, but we're still talking about 500 to 700,000 attempted crossings per year. And we know the left wants to remake the political constituencies of the American Southwest for political purposes. And we know that there's a small elite of the Chicano community in journalism, politics, and the university who wants to have a permanent underclass that they can attribute that a failure to achieve parity on the basis of racism, and therefore themselves are the spokesman, and they do pretty well. And that's where the left is on that issue. So we're going to have to close the border and work with the people that are here that are law-abiding and working. I think everybody understands that.
Victor, you're a fifth-generation Californian?
Yes.
All right. Question about California, our state of California. The Hispanic proportion of the population has risen from about 16% in 1970 to about 37% today. In the decade from 1990 to 2000, 2 million more people left California than entered from other states. Yes. The census of 2010 will surely show an even larger number.
Yes.
So what you've got here basically is largely white, middle-class Californians moving out in large numbers. So this is a crude question, but I don't know how else to phrase it. Has California passed the tipping point?
It's hard to know because I don't know what Hispanic or Mexican means anymore. I've got a brother who's married to a Mexican woman. I've got another brother who's got 2 stepchildren that are half Mexican-American. I've got a friend whose grandson is one quarter Mexican, 1/4 Asian.
That's all good news, right?
It's
we
good.
Either marriage,
Absolutely.
They're Americans. Everybody you name thinks of himself
what
as
I'm
an
thinking
American,
is
right?
happening in California is we have an elite that trills their R's, and if they're named Joe Lopez, they call themselves Jose Lopez. And then they find career opportunities in the media, in the universities. But while that...
professional Hispanics,
exactly.
so to speak.
But while that's going on, in the muscular classes, people are intermarrying and they're starting to interact and assimilate, even though they were told the melting pot is passé, the salad bowl, and it's not true. So that is very positive. And the tragedy is, if we would just stop the border, close the border,
and wait a decade and a half,
and let it mix up, and then allow Mexico to have 50,000 legal immigrants per year, privilege them a little bit more than other countries, we could solve this problem in 20 years.
Segment 4, The New Evil Empire. Victor Davis Hanson, quote, oil-rich Russia, deprived of its communist-era empire, seems to find lost imperial prestige and influence by being for everything the United States is against, selling nuclear material to Iran, providing weapons to Hugo Chavez's Venezuela, bullying neighbors over energy supplies. Close quote. What are the Russians thinking?
They're thinking, wow, we've got a president and we've got an administration that for a brief window of opportunity really wants to reach out and really does believe that the deterioration in Russian-American relations was because of George Bush and not because of things like cutting off gas to Eastern Europe or pressuring the Balkans or pressuring Europe or pressuring the former Soviet republics, any of that. And this is a time really to reach out, praise this administration to the skies, and then take them to the cleaners. And the result is that they're helping Iran get a bomb, they're helping arm our enemies, and they like the status quo.
Here's the piece the piece of the puzzle. It's a big piece of the puzzle that doesn't make sense to me. Russian mortality rate extremely high, birth rate extremely low. Their economy almost zero. It's purely extractive industries. That is to say, the only wealth they have is because they happen to sit on top of land that contains oil, minerals, natural gas, which they can sell to genuinely productive economies. Yes. This is not a good long-term picture. The Muslims, I'm not talking about the Kazakhstan and the this stan and the other stan, but within Russia proper itself,
Chechnya.
Exactly, you've got a large Muslim population, and the birth rate is so much greater in the Muslim population in Russia than that of the Russians proper, that by 2050, Russia will be more than 50% Muslim. So if you're Vladimir Putin and you are trying to preserve some kind of Mother Russia,
wait. This is an argument that leaders and
they ought to be doing business with us. They ought to be begging us for alliances.
Peter, that's like saying that on June 22nd, 1941, the World War II was essentially over. From the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Russian border, from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert, it was all a German Reich. And why in the world would Adolf Hitler invade Russia when Russia was giving them more natural resources to do things like bomb Britain than they ever got when they actually occupied the country for 4 years? So it was absolute lunacy to act against his own self-interest. But he did. And why? Because he had some crackpot notion of Übermenschen and the Ukraine and the Slavs. And this is the same thing with Putin. Thinks he's angry about the Cold War. He's angry at the loss of empire. He's angry that we stopped him. We helped kill Russians in Afghanistan. He's angry. And you could sit down and you could say, Vladimir, what you did in Chechnya is the future. You guys are, wow, you've got problems with radical Islam and you got all the things you delineated. It's not in your interest to be estranged from the United States, your natural ally, and it's an emotional thing. And he likes the idea that we get tangled up in Iraq, we get tangled up in Afghanistan, we get tangled up in places with Israel in the Middle East, we get tangled up with the Iranian bomb. And this is all good that and by the way, the more that we get tangled up, and if there's going to be any preemptive strike in Iran, or the price of oil goes up. Chaos makes Russian profits as far as oil goes.
So what you are asserting here, Victor, is, even though we're talking about Russia in the 21st century, you're asserting something that comes from your understanding of the classics. This is Greek tragedy. This is the perversity of human nature, choosing the boneheaded course of action.
If I could, even though it wasn't a direct quote from the historian Thucydides, he doesn't say that states attack other states because they want their their soil to make pots, or they want olive oil or something. They do it for honor, fear, and self-interest. They act on emotional responses. So asking me why Russia would act against their self-interest is the same thing of saying, why in the world would Argentina, in the middle of a depression with a dictator, invade the Falklands against the British Navy?
Okay.
People do stupid things for emotional reasons that I think have a lot to do with their fears and their sense of honor.
One more question about Russia. Let me quote Illie Berman of the American Foreign Policy Council. He's writing in the Washington Times, quote, "The bulk of Russia's strategic resources are concentrated in the country's inhospitable Far East, Siberia and East. This is a territory that a dying Russia, low birth rates, will find increasingly difficult to harness, let alone to populate in the years ahead. China doesn't have that problem." Again, can't Putin see this? His problems with China dwarf any problems he has with us. Why isn't he?
I agree, absolutely. I think if you could sit down, you could convince him, and then he would still smile at you and say, you're absolutely right, but he has certain reasons for being angry at the United States, or at least seeing us have problems. And that the more problems we have, as I said, the more chaos we have, the less smug and secure we are as the winner of the Cold War, the more that the world is tense, that the energy prices stay high. But he's got a rendezvous with the Chinese along with the many other things like demographic and health issues of the population.
Segment 5, yes. Iran. Daniel Gordis, writing in the October issue of Commentary, notes 2 events this past August. 1, Iran fired up its first nuclear reactor. 2, the Obama administration let it be known through a leak to the New York Times that Iran was still at least a year away from a nuclear weapon, and that the administration had convinced Israel that there was no imminent threat. Let me quote Daniel Gordis. "The United States was determined not to view the working Iranian reactor as a crisis requiring immediate and determined attention. The news accelerated the sense inside the Jewish state that action against Iran would be unavoidable and that Israelis would not be delivered from taking action themselves." Close quote. Has Daniel Gordis got that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, with Obama, we've seen the Rhineland, we've seen the Anschluss, we've seen the Sudetenland. Now all that's left is the invasion of Poland. So we know what Ahmadinejad, he came to the United. This is after we
one provocation after another.
Yeah, after we reached out, Obama sent him a video. We had a real genuine chance of some revolutionary democratic activity last spring, and Obama voted president on that and did not encourage people because he thought that his own unique profile would be so necessary to deal with a problem like Ahmadinejad, and we just wouldn't want a bunch of democratic people out in the streets. It'd be too simple, and he wouldn't be needed. But nevertheless, we missed that opportunity. I don't know if it would have been determinant or not, but it was an opportunity. And now we're going down this road, and we know where it ends. And each time that Obama said, he shook his finger and he said, you better do this by the G20, you better do this by the UN meeting, you better do this by the first of the year. And he's given about 4 deadlines, and they don't matter. And now we get insulted at the UN, and I think it's pretty clear that Mr. Ahmadinejad is going to smile and say he has no interest in nuclear weapons, and then one day, sometime in the next 18 months, he's going to tell us he's got the bomb, and then
Victor,
that's it.
I have a question here from a Ricochet member, Trace Erden, who asks an interesting question. You were just talking about this moment of opportunity, and he writes, did President Obama gain anything by appealing to ordinary Muslims using the bully pulpit? Does celebrating Ramadan in the White House accomplish anything?
I don't think it did. I mean,
I don't think so.
If you came from Mars and you said, are Muslims still trying to kill Americans? Yes, Mr. Mutalab is. Mr. Hassan was. Yes, they are in Times Square. As you and I are speaking right now, headlines in all the newspapers that Muslim sleeper agents are all over Europe trying to kill Europeans and Americans. As we look at Afghanistan, if we look at the situation in the Middle East, if you look at the Pew polls of public opinion, I don't see any difference. The only difference that I see is that whereas we might have been disliked under George Bush, there was some fear that George Bush was unpredictable and maybe a little scary or dangerous. Now there's a sense that we're disliked and that we are very predictable and not at all scary.
The Sunni Arabs, and this includes a lot of rich countries, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, are suspicious of, nervous about, wary of the Shia in Iran. The ambassador to the United States of the United Arab Emirates, a man called Yusuf al-Otaiba, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, but that's the best I can do, speaking in August, quote, I'm quoting an Arab ambassador, "We cannot live with a nuclear Iran. I am willing to absorb what takes place," close quote. So, you have the Sunni threatened by Iran directly. You have Israel threatened by Iran directly. Let them sort out the costs, the benefits, how it is to be done, but let them do it. We don't need to get involved.
Well, I think that reflects the majority opinion in the United States right now.
What's wrong with that?
Well, there's not a lot. I mean, first of all, because they're not going to do anything. They're not capable of doing anything. And the problem is, who's going to build it?
Israelis can't pull off?
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
No. But I share your frustration because you know that the moment we do something, that same speaker, as well as Saudis and Egyptians, will then attack us publicly for harming fellow Muslims, and then privately sending us a telegram of congratulations with the premise that we are sophisticated Americans, we're adults, we have to accept that.
They have to deal with the street, but let's all be grown-ups
and we're
about
tired of that. We've done it for too long, and so the answer, it's a terrible situation with only bad and worse choices, because basically this is the dilemma that we're faced with. Only we can ensure that they don't get a bomb. And yet, if we do ensure that they don't get a bomb, there's going to be terrorism, there's going to be chaos, there's going to be oil, and it's going to affect us more than anybody. And everybody knows that.
Victor, here's the big question in some ways. It's been lurking beneath everything we've said. 7 years of fighting in Iraq. And the newspaper this morning is Maliki is clinging to power, they're maneuvering. They still don't have a functioning government. 7 years of fighting in Afghanistan. Polls show that Americans want to get out. And we still don't have a clear route to victory. Bob Woodward's latest book shows the administration in total disarray, the president trying to divide the difference. China's rising, India's rising, our share, Brazil is rising. Our share of world gross domestic product has been shrinking since the Second World War. So aren't we just in about the same position that Britain was in the middle of the last century? It's over. We're not going to be number one country, able to dominate the globe. Pax Americana was wonderful while it lasted, but we have to cede our position, at least in part, to others. With good grace or ill grace, we have to do it.
But that's only one half of the equation. When you mention Britain, when it ceded its positions in the Mediterranean or in Africa, or gave up its empire, which it should have done probably. But the reason why...
Greece, that's where we get the Truman Doctrine. That's the moment.
It had to, though, because it made a terrible mistake, and that in the late 40s and 50s, it nationalized its steel, its automobile, its power. It became a social redistributive state, and that was why we got out of the Depression. And they didn't really. I mean, we got out of the Depression because we spent all this money in World War II, but then when the tab came due in 1946, and all of a sudden the world was flattened, and we were the only capitalist, free market society that for the next 10 years could supply goods and services and pay off our debt. Britain couldn't, because Germany, if you looked at Liverpool and Frankfurt Liverpool and Dresden or Hamburg in 1945, it would have been one picture. If you looked at them in 1960, it would have been quite another. It'd be like Hiroshima and Detroit, the same contrast.
Victor, last question. To ensure then, so you see a sense of possibility here. You don't see things inevitably closing in. This is not Greek tragedy. This is not an inevitable closing in on the United States that once was. To ensure that the 21st century is as much an American century as the 20th, what do we need to do?
Decline is a choice. It always is by every society. When Rome fell apart in the 5th century, its enemies were just a fraction of what they were during the Punic War 600 years earlier. What we need to do is to ensure that we're a meritocratic state and that people advance or fail according to their skill, their hard work, their ambition, and their knowledge and skill expertise. And we have to have a transparent, lawful society. We have to have a dynamic economy. And if we decide that we are no longer an equality of opportunity society, but we're going to be an equality of result, and you look at where that leads to, whether it's Venezuela, Cuba, the EU, Greece, or the pernicious forms in the former Eastern Europe, it leads nowhere to serfdom. So that's the real question. The United States has got everything it needs. It's got a large population. It's the only truly multiracial successful state in the world. It's got a wonderful constitution. We inherited infrastructure and expertise and traditions from our forefathers. However, if we think that we're not going to be good unless we're perfect, and we're going to socially engineer predetermined results about human nature, and we're going to do this with a technocratic class like Plato's overseers or guardians, and we're going to have an all-powerful monolithic state that's going to direct our lives and destroy American initiative, then yeah, we're going to end up like England about 1950. It's inevitable.
Victor Davis Hanson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution. Thanks for joining us.